Hi Year Nines. This term we're going to be moving on to a new topic which is really exciting. We're going to be looking at Germany between 1890 and 1945, and it's always a student's favourite. So we're going to be looking at three really interesting areas of German history. We're going to look at what it was like under Kaiser Wilhelm II. We're going to see things like what he did to cause World War One. Then we're going to look at something called the Weimar Republic, once they got rid of the Kaiser and they set up this new democracy. And then lastly, when we're in year 10, we're going to be studying Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1945. Now, I'm going to give you more instructions on each slide as we go through, but just so you're aware, if you can do this on lined paper, that'd be fantastic, because basically when you come back, we're going to have folders that we're going to store it all in. If you don't have access to paper, complete it in a history exercise book if you were given one on the last week of term before lockdown. And if you haven't got that, just do it in any book that you can do. It's really important that we have the notes, not necessarily where you're going to put it. Okay, just a quick couple of things. First of all, make sure that you do all of the work that's in the yellow boxes. That's where all the instructions are. It shouldn't take you more than 2 hours, and you can email pictures of all of the work or upload it all onto Teams, but there are certainly 2 tasks on this PowerPoint that we really would like you to make sure that you're handing in so that your teachers can give you a little bit of feedback and check your understanding. They're put in the blue boxes, and I'll highlight those as we go through. Really simple. Just want you to copy out this timeline in your book so that you have a good overview of the different events that we're going to be studying in German history. Okay, so we can actually start getting on with looking at what Germany was like under the Kaiser then. So the first area that we're going to look at is going to be about the constitution. So we're going to see how does it differ to Britain's constitution, and how powerful was the Kaiser. Then once we've done that, we're going to look at what the Kaiser was actually like. We're focusing on just one of them. The word Kaiser just means emperor. We're going to be looking at somebody called Emperor Wilhelm II. And we're going to see whether he was fit to rule Germany or not. So just with this one, I want you to think about this particular picture. What do you think is going on in this picture? Who seems like they've got the power? You know, what kind of people do you reckon are in it? So just going to give you a few seconds to have a little thought about it. So this is a representation here of the Kaiser in the centre. This is when he's being crowned King of Germany in 1888. And you can see lots of rich, powerful people surrounding him that are helping set up his new rule. So for this task, we just want you to quickly write down the title, who held the power in Germany before World War One. Instead, we're going to be looking at the constitution and how Germany was run. Now, if you don't know what the word constitution means, could you please write down the definition at the bottom, the idea that it's the system of fundamental principles according to which a nation or state is governed. So for this task, we just want you to get to know Germany a little bit better. So if you could please do a half-page spider diagram where you put German unification in the centre, in the little bubble, and then your legs are these points that are going to come up here on the left-hand side. So essentially, we just want you to get to know the fact that Germany wasn't actually one united nation called Germany until 1871. Before then, it was a collection of loads of different states, including one called Prussia, which I'm sure you can see, which I've just circled there. So Prussia was the largest state in Germany, it controlled about 50% of the territory, and the capital of Prussia was Berlin. Now, the King of Prussia essentially united the whole of Germany together, and then the King of Prussia became the Kaiser, the emperor of the whole of Germany as it was created. Now, one of these old German states, Austria, they'd actually gone to war against Prussia, and so they weren't allowed to be part of Germany when it was created as this new nation. So that's why they're very similar in terms of language and culture. And we saw when we did World War One how they'd fought together, but actually they weren't allowed to join this new Germany to start with. Okay, so just another quick task here. We just want to see if you can match up some key terms and some definitions. Now, these words are going to be new to you, so it's all right if you get them wrong, but all I'd like you to do is to write down which numbers and letters go together. So for instance, I've given you the answer for number 1, where we can see the Kaiser, the King of Prussia, the German Emperor. That information goes with the letter E on the right-hand side, which you can see here, that he had the power to create war and make peace. He represents the country abroad, and he does things like concluding treaties and alliances. He also has control of the army. So I'd like you to try and have a go at matching the other ones up, please. Okay, so you should have now matched up those together. Now we're going to go through the answers quickly and just make sure you understand the key words and their definitions. So we mentioned already that the Kaiser is the person who had the power to create war and make peace, most powerful individual in the German constitution. 2, the Chancellor, the head of government, essentially is like a prime minister. That one should go with D, where he serves both as the Emperor's first minister and the presiding officer of the Bundesrat. Neither elected or responsible to the parliament, instead they were appointed and responsible to the Kaiser. Number 3, the Bundesrat, the upper house, that should be going with B, and that's the idea that it was made up of states' representatives supported by the Kaiser, and they made the laws. Remember that until 1871, Germany was just a collection of states, so those states still exist, but now they're ruled over by Prussia, by the Emperor of Germany. Number 4 is the Reichstag, which is just the German word for parliament. That goes with C, and that's the idea of it being a debating chamber with some control over finance. They can only approve laws. They can't actually create new ones. And then we've got number 5, German people, the voters. That is men aged 25 or over. Women couldn't vote at this time. Okay, so during the last task, I asked you to talk about who you think is the most powerful person in Germany. Now, during this task, we're going to be copying down this diagram so you can see the kind of the power structure within Germany. Now, you might have noticed that the German people aren't even on there, because even though they selected members of the Reichstag itself wasn't even powerful. So let's go through it just to make sure that we all understand these different sections of government. At the top here, you can see we have got the Kaiser. Now, the Kaiser, as we've said before, just means the emperor. He inherits his position and he rules like a king. But it's not like our queen today, where she has very limited actual power. He was very, very powerful. For instance, he can make all of the major decisions. He can decide things like whether Germany goes to war. He decides their foreign policy. He can decide when the government, the Reichstag, is allowed to be in session and when it's not. He can also pick the Chancellor. Now, the Chancellor you can see here has power over policies and appointments, and essentially they would be somebody that would be loyal to the Kaiser. So he appoints one of his friends, somebody he trusts, to be in charge of the government. And the Chancellor runs the government and proposes new legislation, new laws. Now, he doesn't actually need to have the support of MPs in the Reichstag, the parliament, or he doesn't need the support of state representatives in the Bundesrat. He doesn't actually need that at all. All he needs is support from the Kaiser himself. So the Kaiser is the most powerful. He then selects a chancellor who in turn is in charge of the government. And then we've got the 2 houses of government. So it's kind of like our equivalent today, where we have a House of Commons and a House of Lords. The Reichstag is the equivalent of the House of Commons. The Bundesrat is the equivalent of the House of Lords, but at this time the Bundesrat is much more powerful than the Reichstag. So you don't have to do anything with this information on the slide, but just in case you're still a little bit unsure about some of those key terms or you don't understand how they work together, just read through this and you could make some brief notes if you chose to. Okay, so you've got your diagram of the Constitution. What we'd like you to do now is to write a paragraph about who do you think held most of the power in Germany before the First World War. Now, we'd like you, if you can, to try and use some of the key words below. Fantastic if you can use all 5 of them. So we've got some words there: Constitution, Kaiser, autocracy, people, and inherited. Now, there's a few words there that you might not be used to using all the time, so we've put some definitions there for you. Now, once you've done this, if you can, it would be fantastic if you could upload it to Teams, or if not, to email to your teacher for some feedback, because this is where we can see, have you got to that grade 7 to 9? Can you make a supported judgment about who really held the most power in pre-war Germany, and it will allow us to check your understanding. So if you could do that now, please. Okay, so the next bit that we're going to be looking at is actually Kaiser Wilhelm himself. Now, we've just seen that the Kaiser is the most powerful individual. He makes all the decisions. So whether Germany is ruled successfully or not is going to very much depend on the personality of the leader. Now, this here is Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he's seen by a lot of historians as being responsible for causing World War I, and there was very much a need for him to prove himself. So we're going to look at his personality a little bit more. We're going to look at things like his childhood as well and see why did he become the man that he was. So if you could please put down the title, what was Kaiser Wilhelm II like? We're going to be building up a lot of information about his personality by looking at his childhood first of all, and then looking at him as an adult. So if you click on the link there, it will take you to an 8-minute documentary on Kaiser Wilhelm. Now, even though it's a really short clip, there is so much excellent information that comes from that clip. And it normally takes us an hour when we do it in lesson to kind of stop it and discuss it and talk about what kind of key points we've got down. So as you're watching it, I'd like you to make sure you put a little subheading of the Kaiser's childhood and just bullet point all the different things you can learn about what it was like. So you'll learn things about his disabilities, you'll learn things about how his parents treated him, and all of that is going to be relevant in the final written task. So you've now seen all about the Kaiser's childhood, and you've seen that actually it was quite a difficult one, that he had some issues with his arm and with his balance, and actually that his parents had essentially made him feel like he needed to be corrected, and they were quite harsh in those corrections, especially when you think about things like the issues with his balance and the way they kept putting him back on those horses even though he kept falling off. So all of that is going to have an impact on him as an adult. And essentially what I want you to do now is to look at the pages of information and to try and build up a better understanding of what the Kaiser was like as an adult. Now, you're going to need documents on Show My Homework to be able to do this. There's a document called Week 1 Kaiser Sources. Now, please bear in mind that there is the first page of it here. Obviously, it's too small to read. You'll still need to load it. But there's that first page there. But there's actually some other pages as well. It's about 4 pages long. Now, we're not looking for you to go and write pages of information on this and to spend hours and hours on it. We're asking you here to skim read it. So to read it quickly and extract some really key points that you're going to do as bullet points. You might want to look at things in bold, but also you want to look at new information that you haven't seen before. So for instance, when you look at this first page, where it's from a textbook by a historian, and it says introduction, one of the points that you might pick out of that is, for instance, that he's got anger problems. So somebody described being with the Kaiser as being around somebody, it was like sitting on a powder keg, as in gunpowder, that he could explode at any moment in anger. So there's loads of information there. You just need to pick out certain key things about what he was like as an adult, and that's really going to help you in the final task. So here I've just put down some points of things that I would definitely have tried to pick out about the Kaiser from source A, and then on the next slide I've got sources B and onwards. So key things about him, obviously we've mentioned already he's got anger issues. You know, even his personal physician, his personal doctor said he was utterly perplexed by his behaviour, couldn't understand why he behaved the way he did. You could talk about the fact that it's been said that he has ADD, which makes his behaviour unpredictable and irrational. And you could even talk about the quote from somebody called Bismarck, where he talks about the Kaiser's like a balloon. If you don't keep hold of the string, you never know where he'll be off to. So we've got this quite complicated individual who has real anger issues, but he's also somebody that likes practical jokes and fancy dress parties. So we can see that there's lots of different points here about the Kaiser, lots of different sides to his personality. Let's move on to looking at the next slide. Okay, so we're just going to look at some of the other sources and a few things that you could have picked out. If you picked out different things to this, don't worry, but I'm just going to go over some points that I think are really important that will help you with the final task. So, for instance, the first one I pick out is about source B, where it talks about how the Kaiser makes decisions without any serious scrutiny, just makes very quick decisions off the cuff. Now, if we've got to think about what makes a good leader, for some of you, if I asked you this in lesson, you'd probably say something about somebody that's very thoughtful, very caring, that really makes sure that they weigh up the positive and negative impacts of their decisions. However, the Kaiser doesn't really do that. He makes very quick decisions. He doesn't necessarily worry too much about the consequences. And you'll have to think, does that make him a good leader? Other things that I think are really important to pick out are the third bullet point there from source D, where he wants to make all the decisions himself. So there's lots of evidence to suggest that the Kaiser was quite power hungry, felt a real need to prove himself and prove that he was this kind of fierce leader. Now, another thing that often people say makes a good leader is one that can establish really good relationships with other nations, which can benefit both countries. But the Kaiser does some things to really upset lots of different nations in Europe, and he upsets the balance of power. Now, for instance, one of the things that he does is he calls the King of Italy a dwarf and the Queen of Italy a peasant girl. Now, that's not very good in establishing good relationships with that nation. And if we look at the bottom bullet point, he even calls the English mad as March hares in an English newspaper interview. So he's upsetting lots of different nations and lots of different people. And we have to think, does that make him a good leader? You'll have your own thoughts on that. And I want you to think about that for a few seconds because it's going to lead you on to the next task. Okay, so now we're moving on to the very final task for history this week, which is us coming to a decision about was the Kaiser fit to rule Germany? Now, everybody needs to do a piece of writing on this, but how long it is up to you. So you've got two options for how you do this. Now, you could just do it as a standard P paragraph, so point, evidence, explanations. So you could start with your point where you're going to say the Kaiser was or was not or was to an extent fit to rule Germany. Once you've done your P, you then need to think about your first E, so your evidence. So you want to give some evidence about why do you think he was or wasn't fit to rule Germany. So it might be one of his actions, it might be something about his personality, and so on. Then you need to do the final E, which is about explaining it. So you have to say this would or wouldn't make him fit to rule Germany because, and try and do that in as much detail as you can. Now, the minimum is to do one paragraph, but that one paragraph might actually involve a few different points about the Kaiser and how he was or wasn't fit to rule Germany. So that's the first option. The second option is to write a psychologist report on whether he was fit to rule Germany, which will involve 4 paragraphs. They don't have to be really long, but essentially it will cover the same information, but just be done in a slightly different format. Now, there'll be more information on that on the next slide, but just in case people are choosing option 1 here, I want to be really clear that you need to make sure that you upload this work to Teams or email it to your teacher. So it doesn't matter which one you do, task 1 or task 2, but you need to use lots of information from the lesson today. You need to use examples from his childhood from the documentary clip and what he was like as an adult from the sources that I just went over. And make sure this is the best piece of writing possible to summarise the Kaiser and his personality. Okay, so this is the optional task. You could be doing this one or you could do the one that was on the previous slide. But if you choose this one, you're going to be writing a report as if you're a psychologist looking at the Kaiser and thinking about, is he fit to be in charge of the country? Now, if you do this, I do 4 paragraphs. Paragraph 2 and 3 are going to be much bigger than the others, but it also gives you an introduction and conclusion. So to start with, you'd talk about introducing your subject, the Kaiser. It depends when you're imagining this is being written in. Is it when he first comes to power in 1888 at the age of 29? Is it later on? Is it, for instance, in 1913, just before World War I breaks out? It's up to you. But you want to introduce him, introduce his mental health issues to assess whether or not he's ready to rule Germany or right to rule Germany. Paragraph 2 is going to be much bigger. This is where you can use your video notes to talk about the Kaiser's childhood. You can talk about his experiences, the way he was treated by his family, and really crucially, you need to link it back by explaining how that affected him and whether or not it's affected his ability to be able to rule Germany well. Paragraph 3, you need to talk about the Kaiser's personality now that he's grown up, give specific examples of what people have said about him, and use the sources from the task to help you. And finally, paragraph 4, you need to write a conclusion telling me whether you think he's fit to rule Germany or not. Now, it might be a good idea in that conclusion to also think about the qualities of what makes a good leader, and you could then compare the Kaiser to that. So, for instance, you might talk about things like the ability to listen to other people's advice, and then you could talk about whether or not the Kaiser does that. So lots of ideas there. You can be creative with this. You can talk about your client, the Kaiser, try and use key terms like a psychologist might use, and just try and be really creative because it's quite a nice, fun task, that one. And finally, well done for finishing the written work from today. I'm sure you got lots of excellent notes now, and we just want you to do one final quick task. It should only take about 5 minutes or so, and that's just to complete the small quiz that's on Show My Homework, so we can see how much you can remember from today's lesson, and to just be able to give you a little comment as well with some feedback.